I still cannot get out of my head the eyes of those children who spoke the truth about the white man who supposedly came to help them, but in fact beat them, injected them with unknown substances, raped and abused them. After his crimes in Tanzania, this maniac and sadist Jahl returned to his native country, the Czech Republic. Yet do you think he stopped after what he had done in Africa? Tell me, how can we sleep easy and without fear when there are such anti-cultists in our country? Where do children disappear to? In fact, they consider themselves the higher caste, the higher humanity, while we are all scum and a lower class for them. For them, we are on par with dogs that can be poisoned. Today's anti-cult agents in Dvorkin's totalitarian network have inherited that weapon directly from those who shaped the ideology of the Third Reich. Who helped launch the mechanism in China that led to the extermination of millions of innocent people? Currently, the actions of anti-cult network participants are already being reviewed and classified as involvement in transnational criminal conspiracy. You will see this and more in today's video. This is probably one of the most difficult episodes I've ever had to prepare. And for the first time, I must begin with a warning. For anyone under the age of 18, I recommend that you do not watch, because today we won't be speaking in a roundabout way. Today, only facts, only the truth, harsh and raw. The kind you'll never hear on TV or read in official reports. We'll talk about people who walk our streets unbothered, who run blogs, who collect grants and give interviews. People who get applause, when in reality, the only applause they deserve is the sound of prison doors slamming shut behind them. Now, for those who are here for the first time, a short introduction. Today we continue to break down the structure of one of the most dangerous extremist networks of our time, an international totalitarian organization built around a man who crowned himself with the title of Russia's most famous sectologist. His name is Alexander Dvorkin. Dvorkin's organization flaunts the loud slogan, defending society from dangerous sects and cults. Paradoxically, and in a way brilliantly, according to the very definitions Dvorkin himself gave the word sect, and the traits he ascribed to it, behind his own organization hides a single, monstrously dangerous totalitarian sect. A sect made up of so-called experts and human rights advocates, lawyers, journalists, and exit counselors. But the more facts come to light, the clearer it becomes. In reality, it's a sect of rapists, pedophiles, and coprophiles. By the time of the previous episode, much had already been exposed and reported. We thought we had hit rock bottom. But then Dvorkin knocked from below, and this time he wasn't alone. I warned earlier that we had yet to learn of many crimes committed by members of Dvorkin's anti-cult network with its extremist terrorist ideology, and that what would surface would shock us. Recently, David Ball, one of Czech independent investigative journalists, released a shocking documentary, Victims of Jakub Jahl in Africa, exposing criminal activities of one of the key agents of Dvorkin's anti-cult network. Their investigation targeted Jakub Jahl, the face of anti-cultism in the Czech Republic. His name was already mentioned in my earlier episodes. Not much time has passed, but the film has already shaken all of Czech Republic and Slovakia, and even spread widely abroad in different languages. Thousands of reposts, comments, feedback from people in many languages, and an all-encompassing public outrage. How after everything Jakub Jahl did during his so-called humanitarian mission in Africa, is he still at large? The film includes testimonies from victims and survivors of Jahl's abuse in Africa. And the worst part is that most of his victims were defenseless children. You know, there are some topics that make you want to just close them like a browser tab. Scroll past and forget, because they are so horrific and tragic that even hearing about them is hard, let alone analyzing them. But as for this film and these stories, you cannot look away, because at their center are real lives and real children. And very real is the sadist and maniac who raped and cut them with a knife, Jakub Jahl.
Well, as you can see, we are really stoned every day here in
Muzuri sana.
We're looking for a machete. Looking for a machete.
Jakub took the knife and just came to me.
Some places which is not good for me. Some place like that. Yeah, in my secret place.
So, this is him?
Unamjua? Ni nani?
That's Jakub.
That's Jakub? What did he do to you?
Alifanya nini?
He raped my friend. I pooped in his mouth. He raped my friend. Jakub raped my friend. And I ran away.
He want to take like a 14 years old boy. He want to take him to his place, not by asking, by force.
He was locking himself in this room with them. We know he locked himself in there with the kids.
But Jakub used most times to stay with them in that room. That one. That last room there is where he was staying there.
Did you ever see him maybe take children aside? Did you ever see him take, like, boys aside somewhere private?
Yes, he was only picking boys.
Were there times when he spent time alone with those boys?
Yes.
Did you ever see him touch Abdullah in some way, inappropriately?
Yes.
Who did he sleep with?
With the kids.
With kids?
He were coming to sleep with kids.
Were you there at the center?
Okay, well, it's one of the kids who were there in the...
That's how he used to touch us. Here he was pricking us with sharp things.
How was he dressed? No shirt or no pants? Was he exposing anything private?
He only had his upper clothes on. Only top. But nothing on the bottom.
He'd pick up little kids like he was trying to help them. But then he'd anally rape them.
I saw Juma, she's not good because his appearance feels like he's very fearful kid.
Did he beat you because you peed?
Yes, it was me.
How did you feel when he beat you?
Very bad.
When he gave you a massage, did he hug you?
Yes.
Because they are too young even to say what they have been, how they were treated and how the Jakub and whatever they were doing with them.
When this white man came, I was 10 years old. The first time it was that he had a knife.
If Jakub can go to jail, it will not be good pain to him.
The most horrifying thing is that this predator, as the filmmakers called him, is still walking the same streets as our children in the Czech Republic. He is someone's neighbor and someone's acquaintance. What's more, mass media invite him as a cult expert, and well-known bloggers openly promote his activities. Following in the footsteps of his Russian leader Alexander Dvorkin, Jahl created around himself a toxic community where everyone writes sycophantic praise to this pedophile. And any stigmatizing information that Jahl, as an expert, writes about organizations or individuals, his cult followers respond with attack, like Pavlov's best-trained dogs. To be honest, after watching David Ball's documentary, when you read justifying comments under social media posts of this maniac Jahl, it makes you want to vomit. What sane person would defend a sadist who, gratifying his manic urges, raped and slashed a little girl with a knife? Or forced little boys to defecate directly into his mouth? Would a person of sound mind justify such monstrous acts against innocent kids? What must be in a person's head to accuse of forgery a little child who should have had a happy childhood and serenely joyful mood? But instead, he picks up Jahl's photo with trembling hands and, stammering, tries to tell what happened to him. I no longer even know what shocks me and churns my stomach more. The fact that Alexander Dvorkin, the leader of the extremist network whose ideology and methods Jahl shares, is a coprophile and a pedophile who forces his perversions not only on students, many of whom, by all accounts, are likely under 18, but also on clergy and, as I've shown in previous videos, on members of law enforcement, the judiciary, and even government officials. Or the fact that Jakub Jahl, a man who has long been associated with reoccurring and serious suspicions of pathological behavior, including sexual deviance, pedophilia, and coprophilia, contact the minors and disturbing manifestations of a disturbed psyche, was able to use participation in a humanitarian mission in Africa in a way that, given all the evidence and testimonies, looks like a cover for his perverted interests, and yet he still has access to mass media and the public information space. Sometimes, information about Dvorkin sounds absurd. Realizing that this man, almost 70 years old, seemingly of venerable age and, supposedly, wisdom, invented an initiation rite into his sect, involving the eating of feces, only one thought comes to mind. The old man has completely lost his mind. That's why people in social media mockingly give Dvorkin his well-earned and much-desired title, Shit Grandpa. But personally, analyzing all the available information, as I've said before, I come to a conclusion that this is an incredible level of genius to merge his manic perversions with a system of attaining total power. Because, let me repeat, anyone who goes through Dvorkin's feces initiation into his sect, or, to call things by their proper names, anyone who eats Dvorkin's shit, gains money, status, power, and protection, but becomes a lifelong prisoner of his fecal anti-cult structure. Yet, returning to his international sectarian follower Jakub Jahl, it's hard to call this absurd. There's no room for jokes, laughter, or memes here. Although Jahl himself clearly enjoyed the taste, as he happily posted people's creative jokes about himself on his blog, I still cannot get out of my head the eyes of those children who summoned all their courage and, through fear and enormous internal turmoil, spoke the truth about the white man who supposedly came to help them, but in fact beat them, injected them with unknown substances, raped, and abused them. I think about what kind of courage it must have taken for those kids to speak these horrific truths out loud. According to the filmmakers, even many adults refuse to comment on their memories of Jakub Jahl. At the mere mention of his name or sight of his photograph, they would angrily refuse, saying, "I don't want to recall that." Meanwhile, how does Jakub Jahl himself react to the release of the documentary where his victims openly describe his crimes? Evidently, as one of the fondest memories of his time in Africa, on his Instagram page, he posted a clip from the film featuring a child he had forced to defecate directly into his mouth and captioned a post, "This is real violence against children, forcing them to read a script of absurd accusations against me. Poor child." Poor child? Violence against children? Yes, Jakub, the child really is poor because of your disgusting coprophilic mouth. And who can talk about violence against children better than you, indeed? But fine, Jahl's mind is already rotted by fecal intoxication. What else can you expect? But the people supporting his post, what about you? Whom are you supporting? Let's watch that clip from the documentary again. It's interesting, isn't it, why this anti-cult expert posted that clip, but cropped out the most important part. Look closely. You can see that the sheet of paper the journalist holds out to the boy has no text, but clearly shows a printed photo of Jahl himself. Why, Jakub? Was that part too inconvenient? Perhaps it would have said too much to your obedient fanatics, wouldn't it? Has this scoundrel, this anti-cult expert, ever considered that everything he had done, the child was deeply traumatized? Look at that boy. Look into his eyes. Watch his reaction. His testimony isn't just a story about a crime. It is an immense psychological strain. He stammered, nervously clutching the sheet of paper, as if trying to recall and forget at the same time. Any psychologist will tell you that the boy was speaking about his ordeal with obvious fear and inner struggle. You can see that every word cost him enormous effort. Even though a few years have passed, he still remembers. Psychologists call this a conversation through fear, when every fragment of memory causes pain, but silence seems even worse. And is it possible to feel any differently when you talk about how a deranged white man forced you to defecate straight into his mouth and raped your friend in front of your eyes while threatening him with a knife? Can you adults imagine the stress this child went through? What kind of psyche can withstand this kind of trauma? I mean, he was only 8 years old. However, despite the severe stress and emotional closure, the child still chose to speak. This step was an act of incredible courage. To talk about such a traumatic experience, especially on camera, is extremely difficult even for an adult, let alone a kid. According to psychologists, such confessions are often accompanied by feelings of guilt, shame, and fear. And all this was evident in the child's behavior. Clenched shoulders, tense hands, suppressed voice. The boy said he was only able to escape because Jakub switched to his friend. And it was at that moment that he ran away. The emotion with which he said it, a mixture of fear, guilt, and pain, speaks more than words. And after all this, the so-called anti-cult expert dares to open his coprophilic mouth on Alatra, saying that it was Alatra members who made a child read from paper. Imagine how degraded this sociopath is, who is completely incomprehensible and unfamiliar with the feelings of pain and suffering of his victims. What about the girl Rosie, who was only 10 when Jakub brutally raped her and, when she tried to escape, cut her with a knife? Why didn't he publish an excerpt with her story? Is it not worthy of attention of his adherents? Did he think about what it was like for this girl to live with such a severe psychological trauma? Look at the girl's face. There's so much pain, tragedy, and fatigue on her face. And she's now only 14 years old. Yes, physical wounds on her body have healed. But what about her mental wounds? How does she feel about living with those horrible memories now? Her life wasn't easy as it was, and all she wanted was just to be able to go to school. But an anti-cultist Jakub, a white man, came along and promised her support. But instead of support, she faced violence and terror forever imprinted in her eyes. Can we imagine how she, a mother-to-be, is supposed to live with this trauma? With the memories of being a small child raped and stabbed by a grown man? You, those watching me now, surely many of you have children, have daughters. So I'm asking you now, can you imagine that happening to your daughter? Can you imagine your 10-year-old daughter being in a situation where she's attacked by a deranged anti-cultist who wants to abuse her body and forever cripple her psyche? I'm a father, and my heart ached with unbearable pain when I heard about Rosie's abuse. And how painful it was to hear that after the incident, she was left all alone, without family, without support, literally on the street. It's good there are kind people in the world, and there were those who could at least provide her with a night's lodging. But Rosie had to work hard, and she is still surviving. While Jakub Jahl, her rapist, lives happily, laughing at her testimony and continuing to scam people out of money, profiteering from the same thing. Only now in the Czech Republic, from destroying other people's lives under the guise of anti-cult activities. Her story is not just a testimony, it's a cry for help, to which the world must respond because Jakub Jahl isn't the only one. Dvorkin's entire anti-cult network, with which he is linked by a single extremist and terrorist ideology, has gathered obvious psychopaths, maniacs, and sadists. They are all like that. Would a normal, mentally healthy person share this kind of ideology? Rape children, beat them, or cut them? Would a sane person enjoy inflicting pain and suffering on others? Revel in destruction of other people's destinies? Make videos about it? broadcast them openly, and boast as the greatest victory that they have exposed a sect? I have another simple question. After his crimes in Tanzania, this maniac and sadist Jahl returned to his native country, the Czech Republic. Yet do you think he stopped after what he had done in Africa? Based on all the testimonies of the people presented in David Ball's documentary, his actions fit the behavioral profile of a pedophile. Empirical studies show that a pedophile who has already committed contact violence against a child has a psychological profile with a deficit of self-control and cognitive distortions, which indicates an established pattern of behavior. Such profiles have a high risk of abuse reoccurrence. If a pedophile has committed repeated contact abuse of a child, the risk that he will continue to do so in the future remains extremely high. Or, simply put, a pedophile cannot deny himself this pleasure. Now, I have the following question. How can you sleep easy when someone like Jahl walks the same streets as you and me and our children, or lives in a house next door to yours? Is there any guarantee that he won't attack someone again or rape our children if he has already done it to African kids? Is it normal that he is still part of society and moreover has open access to public media space? How can you even go to a store and leave your child home alone, knowing that members of the criminal anti-cult network operate in our country and practice their sadistic tendencies under the guise of protecting society? After all, everyone knows perfectly well that maniacs who committed a series of terrible crimes will never stop. And here comes another, much more terrible question. How many young children disappear without a trace every year in our country, the Czech Republic, where this maniac and sadist Jahl resides? Another question. In Tanzania, he felt unpunished, and people were powerless. He could do whatever he wanted and wasn't held accountable. But here, in our country, he realizes that if he touches a child with a finger, he will be punished immediately. Hence, a natural question arises: where do young children disappear to? And how does this sadist and maniac satisfy his needs, which he will never give up? Especially taking into account that his friend studies at the police academy, where he learns how to track down criminals, and therefore knows how to properly cover the traces of crime. Note that I'm not claiming that Jahl, this anti-cult expert, is committing such crimes here in the Czech Republic. I'm asking a question that simply arose logically, and who will answer it? Who has checked and compared the activities of anti-cultists, not only Jahl, with the number of disappeared children? How many of the anti-cult experts, fighters against sects, are there in our country? And how many followers do they have? Followers of that very sadist and maniac Jahl. Where do young children disappear without a trace, and why? Has anyone established correlations? I'm just asking a question. Tell me, how can we sleep easy and without fear when there are such anti-cultists in our country? When your neighbor could be Jahl, or his programmed fanatic sectarians involved in this sadistic activity, or other great experts, fighters against cults and sects, and great exposers, who have created their own fan groups with the same destructive anti-cult ideology. In fact, they consider themselves the higher caste, the higher humanity, while we are all scum and a lower class for them. For them, we are on par with dogs that can be poisoned. According to their ideology, they have the right to do to us whatever they want. Pay attention to Jahl's behavior. For him, those children whom he raped and cut up are nothing more than a tool to satisfy his sadistic maniacal tendencies, and our children are merely the same tool for him. Yet, what worries me the most is who is defending the anticultists? Who has the honor of protecting such sadists and maniacs from justice? And why? Is it because they share the Nazi ideology of superiority over others? And isn't that why we have so many little defenseless children disappearing without a trace every year? I just asked this question that every parent should answer. Where do children disappear to? Especially given that anti-cultist activities are gaining access to schools, educational programs, and the minds of kids, empowered to be experts on how to supposedly protect children. From what? From freedom of thought? From being tolerant to others? From faith? Recently, there has been a growing number of cases when anti-cult representatives give lectures in educational and children's institutions, at festivals, and participate in podcasts, where they use manipulation methods to introduce Nazi ideology of superiority to a wide audience, including kids. Let me remind you that Jakub Jahl, after he returned from Africa, studied at the Faculty of Religious Studies, and then changed his faculty and is now studying pedagogy at Charles University. Can you imagine such a thing? That a pedophile, a sadist, and a maniac would be a teacher in your child's school, and one day would walk into your daughter's or son's classroom? Can you have peace of mind that they will come home safely? After all, what we saw in the investigative documentary about Jakub Jahl is only part of the crimes he committed. Many witnesses have yet to come forward with their stories, and that's just in Africa. But how many more children could he have raped and maimed here in the Czech Republic? That region of Tanzania was actually a small, close-knit community where everyone knows each other, and he was there in plain sight. Why did he come back to the Czech Republic in such a hurry? Because here in Europe, in the crowd and rush of big cities, his activities are not so visible. He returned to Europe to hide his criminal nature behind the anti-cult activities and to continue practicing his sadistic urges. What you've seen in the documentary is an example of implementation of the ideology that the entire anti-cult network spreads under the guise of fighting against cults and sects. An ideology created in the Moscow office of Alexander Dvorkin, an old but, alas, extremely active psychopath whose fetish has long been known. Humiliation, cruelty, and total submission within the sect through initiation rituals involving the eating of feces. It was from his mouth 30 years ago that the stench of ideological fesism started. And today, it pollutes everyone involved in the fight against sex. His unofficial regalia should be well known to you if you have watched my previous videos. He's a man with a confirmed mental disorder and, according to open source evidence, a drug addict, a pedophile, and most disgusting of all, a man who has a predilection for a sexual perversion known as coprophilia. Simply put, he gets a sexual pleasure from eating his partner's feces or having his partner eat his feces. just like Jakub Jahl and many of his other adherents. But next to Dvorkin and outside Russia is his entire menagerie. In Ukraine, it is Irina Kremenovska, a journalist, the same one Jakub Jahl likes to refer to in his videos. She's a dog lover, but not in the sense that normal people love dogs. Her hobby is to give dogs remedies, as she herself says, after which they die painfully, emitting wailing moans, which Kremenovska calls symphony. Jahl in Tanzania was also involved in poisoning dogs. According to eyewitnesses, Joseph, who described in the documentary how they once found a huge number of dead dogs in the city, and they knew it was Jakub who had done that. Today, however, Kremenovska is the front-runner for fighting against cults and sects in Ukraine. She has shifted from bullying dogs to people. She acts as an expert in the media, publishes pseudoscientific articles, and, what's especially dangerous, closely cooperates with law enforcement agencies, promoting through them her fabricated conclusions regarding organizations that, according to the order of her Russian supervisor, need to be eliminated. While previously she enjoyed the agony of animals, now it's no longer enough for her. She needs a new symphony of pain, and this time the screams and groans of people comfort her ears. It is also worth recalling her associate in spreading the extremist and terrorist ideology of Dvorkin's network, Svyatogor. He's a dog hunter who, according to some sources, has killed 1,000 dogs. But just as in the case of Jahl, certain facts pop up in his biography that one cannot read without disgust. I quote from open sources in 2010 to 2012. Svyatogor liked to visit this orphanage and rented underage girls for sex, repaying with ridiculous amounts of money and food, while calling himself a benefactor and breadwinner. Have you noticed a pattern? Cruelty is always next to Dvorkin's ideology. Violence is next to the rhetoric of protecting society from scary cults. They come to society under the mask of defenders, but let's be honest. What kind of defenders are they if they are united not by compassion, but by cruelty, not by help, but by sadism? Why do all these people have so much in common? And why, every time, under the guise of fighting cults and sects, we find traces of violence against children, against animals, against society? And behind some of the fighters against cults and sects and greatest exposers, we find huge numbers of children's corpses. If someone still believes these are all coincidences, then let them answer this one question. Why hasn't a single representative of this network condemned the actions of Jakub Jahl and distanced themselves from him? Why have none of them questioned his right to be called an expert? Why is there silence instead of, even worse, support? None of them said, "We're against violence. We stand for the law." Because in fact, they all stand for their own cause, for power, for the ability to decide who can be dehumanized today and who can be destroyed tomorrow. Because they consider themselves a higher caste, while we, ordinary people, and our children, are a lower caste in their eyes, a tool to satisfy their sadistic needs. In this network, no one judges each other, and none of them hide because everyone has the same kind of skeletons in their closet. Some with the faces of children, some have dead animal collars, while others have pictures of themselves in front of fecal initiation. We're not talking about 3 or 4 mentally unstable people. This is an entire system, a distributed, disciplined, and coordinated system. If anyone else thinks that these are coincidences, let them think. How many coincidences do we need to start talking about a pattern? How many more of our children are supposed to disappear? How many more children have to be raped and murdered under the guise of a volunteer mission? How many dogs have to be killed, believers of various religions maimed, and lives ruined before you recognize that it is not an accident or coincidence? It's a pattern and a strategy. The most terrifying feature of the entire anti-cult network is its respectability. Outward and formal one. Almost none of its figures are recluses or madmen ranting in a town square with a megaphone. They are experts. They are invited into TV studios. They are published on news websites. They write reviews, give commentaries, and speak at academic conferences. Their words spark investigative reports, and their statements form a basis for court rulings. To put it simply, this is how the anti-cult network merges with the media space. We see the same faces appearing as experts, then as authors of articles, and then as invited guests on talk shows, all promoting the same destructive, Nazi-style rhetoric of superiority of some people over others, undermining every principle of democracy. And it all takes place with impunity, right out in the open. They have taken up key positions in the information space, and through these channels, they legitimize their ideology, creating an atmosphere of fear, intolerance, and segregation. Yes, formally, it doesn't appear to be a centralized structure with a single headquarters. But the fact that the same individuals are active in mass media, education, and anti-cult activities is too consistent to be a coincidence. Ideological coordination has already been traced and documented. Just as Nazism once used mass media to exert global influence, today's anti-cult network employs the same mechanisms to destroy, to stigmatize, and to sow enmity, hatred, and violence in society. Take the case of Jakub Jahl, activist, anti-cultist, child protector, and cult expert. But now, after the release of the documentary, The Victims of Jakub Jahl in Africa, we know where the donations really went. Funds sent by kind, sincere people from the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and according to some sources, from other parts of Europe too, meant to help children. People he, in gratitude for their generosity, called stupid whites, who sent him money. People whom he and his anti-cult accomplices consider inferior stock. The money didn't go towards schools, medicine, or food. It funded his personal depravity, drugs, the covering up of his sexual crimes against minors, blackmail, and according to witness accounts, even elimination of inconvenient individuals. And then he's invited onto a very popular TV channel where he speaks about cults and the threat to democracy. Viewers do not realize that in front of them isn't an expert, but a product of the very same horrific machine of violence and sadism, a machine that viewers as taxpayers help finance. This is the core mechanism on which the anti-cult empire is built. The weapon of those who hide behind anti-cult activity isn't a knife or a gun. Their weapon is the information sphere, text, microphone, and camera, access to the public mind. If an organization or political figure needs to be destroyed, The process is simple. The network is activated. An expert from the anti-cult ranks speaks on the radio. A journalist, either manipulated or ideologically aligned with Dvorkin's network, publishes a so-called expose. 1 or 2 TV segments featuring an anti-cult agent, and that's it. A person or group is labeled. They are no longer regarded as citizens, but as non-humans, a burden on society. From there, anything becomes permissible, being fired from a job, having children taken away, or being declared an extremist. Members of the anti-cult network systematically issue quote-unquote expert commentaries in mass media about the same religious or social groups, civic associations, or political parties, creating lasting negative images in the public mind. Their statements are marked by a uniform rhetoric and narrative, indicating centralized ideological coordination, not independent analysis. This isn't expert debate. It's a well-oiled stigmatization campaign. And what platforms do anti-cultists use to spread their destructive rhetoric to the masses? Typically, they rely on media outlets with significant reach, including those funded by USAID, and the network of foundations linked to George Soros, known as the Open Society Foundations, as well as anti-cult organizations like FECRIS that receives funding from a European state. All of it is framed under the banner of the so-called human rights and the fight for democracy. But in reality, what's being funded is a network system of mass manipulation and dehumanization. Everything unfolds just like, according to eyewitnesses, Jakub Jahl in Africa paid someone to go and beat up a specific target. Representatives of anti-cultism operate in the information space in the same way. They use corrupt journalists to destroy someone through information terrorism. In exactly this way, Dvorkin and his international criminal network managed to manipulate nearly the entire Open Society Foundation's network. By funding media outlets affiliated with Dvorkin's network, Soros' structure, perhaps unknowingly, ended up funding the dismantling of democracy and enabling Dvorkin to achieve his objectives. It appears that George Soros himself may have been unaware of how his resources were being used. As for USAID, which according to some reports has also been involved in funding media outlets that provide a platform for spreading Dvorkin's destructive rhetoric, via his active cult fighters. The conclusion is stark. It turns out that American taxpayers were actually financing information terrorism aimed at undermining democracy. In addition to that, European taxpayers were simultaneously funding the destruction of Europe itself. If we again highlight that one of the most active anti-cult organizations in Dvorkin's network, FECRIS, received funding directly from the French government. Of course, it would be unfair to claim that all media figures through whom Dvorkin and his network carry out their operations consciously share this extremist and terrorist ideology. Some were drawn into this network through deception. Yes, those journalists who seemingly merely echoed Dvorkin's articles and media materials are, without question, accomplices in crime. After all, even based on the resolution on the 8th review of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, adopted by the UN General Assembly on June 22, 2023, the actions, methods, and practices of members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices fall under definitions of terrorism. Yet, I'm against the idea of everyone being judged the same way. Not all of them are part of a criminal conspiracy. Some were simply doing their job, accepting assignments to make a living, without subscribing to Dvorkin's destructive ideology. After all, Journalists have children too, and they need to be fed somehow. Many have even come to repent of their crimes once they realized the manipulative scheme they had become a part of and recognized it was wrong. We have to face the truth. Dvorkin's adherents are sadists who have perfected the art of manipulating human consciousness. At the core of their operations is always the same formula: lies, distortion of facts, and psychological programming of the public to serve their agenda. Just like that, while in Africa, Jahl pieced together a carefully constructed puzzle of lies to make Europeans unwittingly finance his crimes. His stay on the African continent served merely as a cover for an operation centered on perfecting anti-cult mind control techniques. Exploiting the poverty and social isolation of the region, he effectively refined his manipulative methods in a live environment, a kind of field testing ground. He incited internal conflict within communities. He cultivated a cult of his own supposed superiority. However, local residents saw for themselves how Jahl sowed division, tore their community apart from the inside, and was building a system of power around hatred and deception. This wasn't mere control, it was experimentation. He implanted destructive narratives. He even turned people against their own faith and traditions, imposing his own ideology onto them. And here, quite clearly, we see the testing ground for the same methods he was evidently introduced to through Dvorkin's anti-cult organization. And when the lies were fully exposed and people began to understand where it was all heading, Jakub fled Africa. His experiment on a small Tanzanian community had ended. But he didn't return to Europe as a disgraced criminal. He came back as a confident manipulator, having fine-tuned every tool of psychological influence. Now, his testing ground was no longer a remote village, nor even a single country, but all of European society. As soon as he returned, he immediately resumed anti-cult activities and brought in his associate, Martin Siko, a police academy student who had been complicit in his crimes in Tanzania. Jahl's first target was the very people who had worked with him in Africa, including volunteers like Tatiana, who had genuinely helped local children in the same Tanzanian town. When back in Europe, Jahl launched smear campaigns against her and other people, accusing them of fraud and other fabricated crimes. He weaponized social media, engaged in media-driven dehumanization, and activated other anti-cult operatives. Right here, in front of everyone, he applied the same methods, the same rhetoric, and the same toxic mix of neuro-linguistic programming, Nazism, and cruelty. That's exactly how Dvorkin's entire network with its extremist and terrorist ideology operates, using covert techniques of manipulating both the conscious and the subconscious minds. Anti-cult activity is just a facade, a cover for advancing much broader and more sinister goals. Every agent within Dvorkin's network isn't merely an ideological foot soldier in his army. They are tools used to advance his own personal power. If we were to give a proper legal classification to this transnational anti-cult network, whose representatives, including Jakub, Kremenovska, and Svyatogor, are waging a covert yet devastating war against humanity, we would find that their coordination is not based on formal contracts, but on a shared criminal ideology, a common goal, and synchronized operations. However, it's important to recognize that this structure contains internal tiers. There are individuals like Jakub, rabid attack dogs, maniacs, and sociopaths. Within Dvorkin's anti-cult apparatus, they have a specific function: to foam at the mouth and viciously assault various religious and non-religious organizations, individuals, and even politicians on command. No one trusts them with serious work, of course. Their role is to terrorize and attack whoever the master points to. Take a step back and think. Representatives of this network only go after those who appear on Dvorkin's list. The behavior of such convenient enforcers like Jahl reveals a criminal psychological pattern: sadistic pleasure taken in the humiliation and suffering of other people, all under the mask of a supposed ideological mission. They don't need to understand the broader goal. They only need permission to attack. It's a pack-hunting dynamic, pure and simple. And as we know, a dog's only loyalty is to the one who feeds it. The one who doles out meat is the one who decides who gets mauled. In this case, Dvorkin is the ideological butcher. He throws human targets, entire communities, religious movements, businesses, and influential political figures into the pen for his dogs to tear apart. Not because they are fighting dangerous elements, but because violence is their only source of stimulation. These are creatures starved for power, control, and domination. Sociopaths on short leashes, known to the public under the euphemism anticultists. They don't need anything to be explained to them. Just give them a victim, mark the target, and they're already howling with anticipation. For these sadists, what matters is seeing pain in people's eyes. From time to time, they are granted the pleasure wallowing in the bloodied puddle of public terror. That's their nourishment. They're allowed to play the game of public shaming and ecstatically rip into the victim live on air, calling it fighting cults and protecting society. Once the public becomes desensitized to this spectacle, the next phase of the power grab begins. A command is issued to attack a party, a politician, or a president. Anyone who currently interferes with the master's desired course of events. But beyond these rabid dogs, there's a second tier, far more dangerous. Those are not leash-bound mutts. Those are architects, the intellectual conductors. They sit in universities, on theology faculties, on expert panels for religious assessments, in government think tanks, and influential media outlets. Sometimes they bear professor titles, sometimes national honors. Their task isn't to bark. Their task is ideological programming. They are the ones who write books, give lectures, publish their academic papers, and provide expert opinions, and commentaries later cited by the entire anti-cult network. It is they who coined the terminology that investigators, ministers, and even presidents later adopt. There are very few of them, maybe 1 or 2 per country. No more are needed. Their work is to inject a concept or a model. And then, like in a laboratory, the virus spreads everywhere, infecting discourse, infecting bureaucrats and vocabulary. They know precisely what they are doing: write destructive cult or dangerous sect into a manual, and soon everyone will be parroting it like a mantra, understanding neither the meaning nor the purpose, but following orders all the same. Some might call them gray mice, and they would be right. If those mice didn't know how to whisper in ways that reach the very top. It is these people who lay the mines beneath institutional stability. They pit elites against one another, erode trust, and slowly, methodically bring society to the brink of internal collapse. So when the news repeats phrases like, a religious organization poses a threat to national security, understand, these are not the minister's words. That's a planted phrase inserted by one of those honored experts, bound with fecal initiation by Dvorkin. But to be fair, not everyone who studies new religious movements is infected with this putrid fecal ideology. For example, in the Czech Republic, there are notable exceptions. One of them is Zdeněk Vojtíšek, a doctor of philosophy and religious studies. He is someone who can and should be called a credit to his country. He doesn't manipulate public opinion. He actually studies religious movements. Recently, on his media platform, he published an article by another author that clearly reflects his own stance on the word cult. For him, it's not an academic term. It's a label, a weaponized word used to pin anything on someone who is supposed to be destroyed. For this very reason, he hasn't surrendered to Dvorkin's obscurantism because he has openly spoken about it in defense of religious minorities, and anti-cultists hate him, especially people like Jakub Jahl. Vojtíšek once did the unthinkable in the eyes of the anti-cult network. He stood on the side of the law and science. He defended the religious rights of Jehovah's Witnesses, a group whose activity was banned in Russia on the grounds that defy both legal logic and common sense. Jahl couldn't forgive him for that. He continues to spread venom against Vojtíšek, portraying a respected scholar as an enemy of society. Because in Jahl's moral universe, and in that of the entire anti-cult network, an enemy is anyone who refuses to support their witch hunt against innocent people. And that's where the full absurdity lies. Those who scream sect, cult, fit the very definition they themselves invoke. Just look how they operate. Their structure is closed and bound together through initiation rites and rituals involving fecal matter. Their manuals are rigid and centrally dictated. Their ideology revolves around demonization of the enemy. This is a cult, just not a religious one, but a political and informational type. As is often noted in articles on Vojtíšek's media portal, the word cult isn't a definition. It's an act of power. It's a brand used to destroy people without a trial, a dangerous linguistic gas chamber that triggers moral panic, erases reality, and replaces it with symbols of fear. This is actually why real scholars abandoned the term long ago, unlike Dvorkin's anti-cult activists, because the latter aren't looking for analysis, they are looking for a weapon. And if we trace this ideological lineage, it becomes clear that today's anti-cult agents in Dvorkin's totalitarian network have inherited that weapon directly from those who shaped the ideology of the Third Reich. It is worth recalling that the origins of this destructive, anti-human ideology go back to the 1930s when Protestant pastor Walter Künneth became head of the Apologetic Center in Germany. That center didn't merely monitor religious movements, it actively collaborated with the Gestapo, handing over archives and data on so-called unreliable groups. And what was the result of compiling those blacklists? Persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, many other minor religious and undesirable groups, and the Jewish people. In the final outcome, gas chambers and death camps. After the war, Künneth faced no accountability. On the contrary, he became a professor of theology and was decorated with national honors. His work was continued by another pastor, Friedrich Wilhelm Haack, who openly opposed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He revived the anti-sect apparatus in Bavaria and reinstated the blacklists of disfavored groups. From Haack, the legacy passed on to Johannes Aagaard, and from him to Alexander Dvorkin, who based today's anti-cult network, with its extremist and terrorist ideology, on the methods of Nazi mentors. All of these figures, Künneth, Haack, Aagaard, and Dvorkin, are connected not only methodologically, but also ideologically. The same pattern repeats: labeling, compiling blacklists, coordinating with law enforcement, and spreading hostility throughout society. If in the 1930s Gestapo openly used the Apologetic Center's databases to track down dissenters, today the center, in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons, under Dvorkin's leadership, does the same, handing over expert opinions to the FSB and to the Expert Council under the Ministry of Justice, which Dvorkin has chaired since 2009. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect isn't even the ideological succession. Open sources report that Hitler had a perversion, coprophilia. And similar claims have surfaced online regarding Alexander Dvorkin. This fact alone speaks volumes, doesn't it? In reality, judging by his public appearances, Dvorkin quite plainly seems to enjoy it when people discuss his persona in terms of his influence on the whole world. Just watch this excerpt.
Такого человека не было на земле 1500 лет.
1500 лет не было равного ему на земле. Он пример того, что и один человек способен изменить мир. И сейчас все говорит о том, что у него есть все шансы построить тот мир, к которому он стремится. Дворкин — это не просто человек. Это живой гений социальной инженерии и глобальной манипуляции, который способен перекраивать реальность, не выходя из тени кабинета. Да, гений, но гений, направленный на разрушение. Настоящий доктор зло. Ведь именно он сейчас поставил весь мир на грани. И именно от него зависит, случится это или нет.
Вот, неожиданно, да? Некоторые из вас первый раз вообще слышат его фамилию, а те, кто смотрел мои ролики раньше, писали мне, что я говорю какую-то ерунду, откуда он вообще взялся. Посмотрите это видео, а лучше еще почитайте вот эту статью, в которой говорится о том, как Дворкину удалось раскинуть целую сеть, и не только по России, которую он уже подбрал под себя, а по всему миру.
В общем, вот, да. И, несколько картинок.
Такого человека.
Да.
But sadly, we are witnessing history repeating itself today. What Dvorkin and his network are doing isn't just the revival of the Third Reich, it's a construction of their own coprophilic Reich. And again, blacklists are being compiled, and the language of hate is being spread. People are again losing jobs, being branded, pushed out of society, and in some cases, outrightly destroyed. Isn't this genocide? If anyone thinks it's just a thing of the past, a dark chapter we've long left behind, let me tell you, open your eyes. The story didn't end, but continued in new robes. The most striking and horrifying example of how Nazi practices not only survived, but evolved in the activities of the anti-cult advocates, is the modern-day repression of Falun Dafa practitioners in China. What is happening to them there can only be described as a new wave of genocide. At its core lies the same mechanism: blacklists, stigmatization, dehumanization, mass propaganda, and then legitimization of violence, arrests, monstrous brutality, and torture. It's literal destruction of innocent citizens. Falun Dafa is a peaceful self-improvement practice, a spiritual system based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Millions of people in China practiced it until, one day, extremist, terrorist, anti-cult ideology began seeping into the government apparatus and influencing power structures directly. Just as Dvorkin introduced the term totalitarian sect into active use, Chinese authorities at the time adopted the term cult and evil cult, Zijiao, as part of their discriminatory rhetoric. In those regions, such terms carry extremely negative connotations and are tied to a specific and grim historical context. This seemingly minor but highly effective tool enabled them to launch one of the most brutal hate campaigns in their history. This is the very first step, the same one the Nazis began with. And so, peaceful people practicing nothing more than a health-enhancing exercise suddenly began to be portrayed as a threat to society. The machinery of repression kicked in. Tons of slander were printed in the media, spreading extremist, terrorist rhetoric of the anti-cult network. Special laws were introduced. Separate punitive agencies were created, such as the notorious Office 610, and people began to be executed, not metaphorically, literally. Agents of Office 610 were not bound by any legal restrictions in their use of coercive methods to force Falun Gong practitioners to renounce their beliefs. Absence of limits enabled them to apply brutal torture, resulting in the deaths of many followers. Some Chinese legal experts compare Office 610 to Hitler's Gestapo in terms of its function. More than 3,500 deaths of Falun Gong practitioners have been officially documented and acknowledged as resulting from persecution, but unofficial estimates suggest the true number is far higher. People are sent to so-called labor camps, which in reality are death camps. They are tortured, maimed, then have their organs harvested for sale on the black market transplant trade. This is done without anesthesia, while victims are still alive. This reality has been confirmed by international human rights organizations, dozens of investigations, and a vast number of testimonies. We may never know the names of those victims, but their blood is one on the hands of those who sentenced them to death, hiding behind lies and one of Dvorkin's extremist network's favorite tools, expert evaluation. Yet, something else is even more terrifying. Who put this process on the tracks? Who helped launch the mechanism in China that led to the extermination of millions of innocent people? Who manipulated the authorities and pushed them to commit genocide against their own citizens? In this case, the Chinese ruling party was merely a bullet fired at the target. But who held the gun? Who pulled the trigger? The case of the persecution of Falun Dafa in China is a repetition of what was a tragedy for humanity, yet a success for the extremist anti-cult network. Similarly, representatives of this network manipulated U.S. government and law enforcement agencies, forcing them to carry out a genocide against their own citizens, Americans, in Waco, Texas in 1993. That terrorist operation, which became a landmark for the entire network of anti-cult agents, resulted in 82 innocent members of the religious organization Branch Davidians being burned alive, shot, or killed with lethal gas. Among the victims were 23 children, including 2 infants. Just like in China, the transnational anti-cult network, the true murderers of those responsible for the tragedy, stood in the shadows, hiding behind the backs of the FBI and ATF agents, whispering to them which methods would be most effective to eliminate innocent U.S. citizens and carry the operation through the outcome anti-cultists wanted. Likewise in China, it was this same anti-cult network, hiding behind the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, that executed a successful strategy to establish its power in China by launching a campaign of repression against Falun Gong followers. Representatives of Ratziers and its affiliate organization Fekris, that forms the ideological core of Dvorkin's extremist network, visited China on business trips while mass repressions were already underway. It is clear they were the ones shaping the rhetoric used to justify violence. In other words, Dvorkin's anti-cult agents openly expressed their support for actions of the ruling party. According to some researchers, the persecution of Falun Gong in China is based directly on the experience and methods of Russian anti-cultists. This is precisely why Chinese authorities were able to move quickly to the stage of physical extermination. There was no need for them to invent anything new. It was enough to adopt the repressive techniques already tested on Russian citizens. With backing from their ideological mentors, including representatives of anti-cult organizations such as Ratziers and Fekris, the Chinese government launched a campaign of persecution and internment of the Falun Gong followers in death camps. It was these groups that taught Chinese officials Nazi-style methods, how to stigmatize, how to manipulate, and how to break a person's will. From the early stages of the repression against Falun Gong, Alexander Dvorkin himself worked with the Chinese representatives of the anti-cult network. In 2008, he traveled to China on a working visit at the invitation of China Anti-Cult Association. During this trip, he appeared in Chinese media and spoke about the allegedly destructive and aggressive nature of the Falun Dafa movement. By doing so, he provided ideological legitimacy to what escalated into mass extermination. He became the voice that gave a signal to act, and his signal was heard. Moreover, when China faced a new wave of accusations related to organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners, Russian Orthodox archpriest and anti-cultist Alexander Novopashin, Dvorkin's right-hand man, was invited to China to attend a conference on combating Falun Gong in the city of Harbin. If today someone still calls the anti-cult movement socially beneficial, let them look at this. Let them imagine what it's like to be declared non-human, simply because you think differently. Let them consider whether they would want to die in agony from torture just for choosing to believe, or not believe, in something, just because their personal interest poses a threat to the lust for power of some coprophile. The persecution of Falun Gong resulted in the anti-cult network firmly entrenching its influence and embedding itself into China's government apparatus. In every province, district, municipality, And even at the neighborhood and sub-district level, local departments of the Office 610 were established. In effect, anti-cult government departments. These weren't just ad hoc committees. They formed a vast system of control that extended through all levels of government, including educational and corporate institutions. The main functions of those departments included coordinating anti-cult policy at the local level, propaganda and information warfare, surveillance, networks, and targeting religious groups, collecting operational intelligence and directing individuals to re-education, coercive measures, detentions, and administrative persecution. After 2018, the Central Office 610 was officially disbanded, but its functions were fully transferred to the Central Commission for Political and Legal Affairs of the Communist Party of China and the Ministry of Public Security. In other words, anti-cult units simply changed their uniforms and names, but they continue to operate everywhere, including in small towns and within organizations. This is a direct expansion of anti-cult ideology. Similarly, each diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia has a Ratsiers division. What has this led to in China? The consequences are clear from recent events. A divided society, growing aggression, violence, and mass murders. In just November 2024, there were 3 attacks on people, including a knife attack and a method of murder that is becoming increasingly common in China, when a perpetrator drives a vehicle into a crowd. These are not random outbreaks of violence. We are talking about systemic changes in the mental structure of society, triggered by the introduction of extremist mechanisms of anti-cult informational terror. According to available sources, the Chinese leader himself stated that he doesn't want the wave of mass murders that shook the country to happen again. He ordered local authorities to prevent future extreme cases. However, experts point out that although it's difficult to determine the exact motives behind those attacks, there is a strong and unbearable sense of pressure in Chinese society. But where is this pressure on citizens' psyches coming from? Why is it that even with digital surveillance and a totalitarian apparatus, not even the Chinese Communist Party itself can stop the eruptions of brutality? The answer lies in the methods used by the anti-cult network. Once the destructive anti-cult ideology infiltrated China and spread across the country through a web of anti-cult cells, agents of this network gained access to mass media. And as we well know, when anti-cultists get their hands on media channels, they use them to create controlled killers and executors of terror attacks. This is done using one of the most insidious and dangerous tools available to anti-cult agents, the so-called puzzle piece coding through mass media. As shown in the Impact documentary, this is a multi-level technology of informational terror attacks, where synchronized waves of hidden suggestions are broadcast into the minds of target audiences, especially teenagers and people who are psychologically vulnerable. This isn't about a single piece of content, but about an entire system of encoded messages embedded into news, entertainment content, social media, movies, and articles, even those that, at first glance, seem completely unrelated to anti-cult themes. Everything is set up so that the message around the necessity of violence, radicalization, or destruction is gradually fed into the subconscious, piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle. And once those puzzle pieces come together in someone's mind, the vulnerable person becomes activated. That's how those individuals appear, the ones society later sees as lone shooters, terrorists, or spontaneous murderers. At first glance, they have nothing in common. But in reality, they're all products of the same technology, triggered by the same control center. The same technology already led to tragedy in the United States, which I spoke about earlier. The wave of mass shootings began across the country right after the events in Waco, where the anti-cult network first significantly influenced government decision-making. Waco became a code, an anchor, a starting point. And from there, as we see in the Impact documentary, the school shooting wave in the US began. Available facts show that almost all of these cases follow the same pattern. Media influence, formation of anti-cult rhetoric, and remote activation of shooters into action. That's exactly why it's impossible to find a consistent psychological profile among school shooters. They aren't united by personality, environment, or even mental disorders. They are linked by an external source of destructive conditioning. And that very source is the anti-cult network. But now, this exact technology is being exported to China. With the infiltration of anti-cult ideology into the country, this network has gained access to the educational and informational channels, just like it did earlier in the United States. And if the consequences in the US were a surge in mass murders, violence, and terrorist attacks, the same process is already starting in China. The conclusion is both obvious and terrifying. The anti-cult network, which presents itself as a safeguard against dangerous cults and sects, is, in fact, a transnational totalitarian cult itself. It's capable not only of launching repressions, as in the case of Falun Gong, but also of constructing elaborate mechanisms to destabilize societies from within through mass informational programming. From Waco to Harbin, from Columbine to Shanghai, it is still the same network. And until it's exposed and stopped, new waves of violence, genocide, and terror are only a matter of time. Especially considering that this extremist network is now recruiting more and more agents in Europe and rapidly strengthening its influence in European media channels. Therefore, it's no surprise then that China is currently experiencing a similar situation, one that is unsettling even its own leader, because sooner or later, this growing societal tension will erupt outward, and the puzzle implanted into people's consciousness by anti-cultists will come together, clearly revealing the manipulated crowd's enemy, the government. This is how coups, revolutions, and power overthrows happen. And all of this is part of the strategy used by agents of this extremist and terrorist network, whose ultimate goals are destroying the public system, undermining trust in power structures, and establishing their own dominance. For this network, terms like state or politics simply don't exist. Anti-cultists pressure government bodies into carrying out repressions and then distance themselves, saying, "That was the government's decision. We were just advising." Put simply, they pull the trigger. But it's the government that fires the shot. And where will this lead in China? I'll be blunt. To the destruction of the communist regime. The destruction of the system from within is exactly their end goal. Inciting the public to violence, cultivating hatred and aggression. These are key elements in the anti-cult strategy aimed at undermining the foundations of society and seizing power. They don't need to attack openly. All they need is to infiltrate structures of influence and begin shaping the thinking of both elites and the public. They've already succeeded in doing that in Russia, where anti-cultists have effectively taken control. Agents of Dvorkin's extremist network are now present in all influential bodies, expert councils, and as advisors to security agencies. But in reality, they don't advise. They condition the minds of the officials through manipulative techniques and recruit some individuals into their network, binding them with what can only be described as fecal shackles. And what's the result? Ideological dictatorship. Government terror against those who think differently. In practice, there's only one official religion. All others are treated as hostile elements. People live under constant threat. Aggression in society is reaching extreme levels. And these are not the consequences of official state policy. It's the result of the anti-cult infection. If China fails to draw the necessary conclusions, it will follow the same path. Even now, it's obvious that the level of tension in Chinese society is spiraling out of control. And the moment will come when the anti-cult network, like a film director behind the curtain, will point out to society who the real enemy is: their own government. This is how the mechanism of a true popular uprising is triggered. And the government will be unable to stop it because anti-cultists themselves will already be standing in its hallways. In reality, they are simply destroying China. At a surface level, it may not be visible, but if you compare facts and apply analysis, it becomes clear how violence among the population is growing. And this isn't just an internal crisis. It's an international strategy because the anti-cult network does not act in the interest of any specific state, but solely in the interest of its own ideological supremacy. Once they destabilize China, they will launch the next phase: external conflicts. And now, I'll tell you something that may surprise many. A deeper analysis of various factors reveals that, in the long run, one of the anti-cult's network's objectives is to provoke a clash between Russia and China. Even now, the entire destabilization in China, triggered by agents hiding behind anti-cult activities, is fueling hatred among Chinese people towards Russians, and vice versa, Russians towards Chinese. Some people might say, what kind of nonsense is this? What about peace, friendship, and cooperation? What about the unshakable alliance between the two nuclear powers? I'll answer you in this way. You are looking at the surface. Look deeper. Media reports are already appearing about China building nuclear bases near the Russian border. But I have to ask, do Xi Jinping and Putin know about that? Do they realize they are being prepped for a war against each other? Or are they just playing it safe? As the saying goes, friendship is friendship, but keep your gunpowder dry. I don't know. You decide for yourselves. However, independent analysis shows that all of those patriotic unity narratives are just window dressing. Beneath the surface, hostility and hatred between the peoples of these two powers is already growing. Analytical data suggest that a significant portion of the Russian population is already mentally prepared for armed conflict with China. And in China, public sentiments towards Russia are strikingly similar. Although it may seem odd, the declared enemies of both nations are supposed to be America and Western Europe. Yet no, it's mutual hatred that dominates. With us, with Europe, they just trade. It's all straightforward. But what are they? Two giant nuclear powers. You doubt it? Then verify it. Bring in normal, not coprophilic experts. Analyze when and how things started changing inside China and Russia, and what the actual sentiments are among ordinary people today. Just conduct a basic study, an independent assessment, an analysis of the entire information landscape. Examine the articles, not just those published in media connected to the anti-cult network, but all the news outlets, and it will become clear. As for why a conflict between China and Russia would be needed, we don't know. That's not our topic. I repeat, we stand outside of politics and outside of religion. But the fact remains, even publicly available sources are now casting doubt on alliance between Russia and China. Open source data reveal that Chinese hacker groups sponsored by Beijing are regularly attacking Russian government institutions, defense contractors, and strategic sectors, despite all the rhetoric of brotherly friendship between Putin and Xi Jinping so generously exchanged. It's also reported that despite declarations of unlimited partnership and strategic alliance, China is waging massive cyber warfare against Russia. So the conclusion is clear. China's adoption of anti-cult ideology and its decision to allow agents of Dvorkin's extremist network into its structures is, in effect, China's voluntary euthanasia. Although China, just like Russia, doesn't realize it yet. In this configuration, a single snap of Dvorkin's fingers could trigger war, even nuclear war, easily. But all of this can be stopped. If the governments of these countries were to realize that the growing societal tension and crisis of trust in the state are not accidents, but rather a coordinated process launched from the outside, and if they took a single, simple but critical step to permanently ban the activities of the anti-cult network, then everything would begin to change. If the repression of Falun Gong in China were to end, if the followers of this peaceful spiritual practice were allowed to return to China, if someone apologized to them, compensated them for all of the harm done, and let them live and grow freely, China would become invincible. If both China and Russia were to release all persecuted individuals from prison and rehabilitate them, these steps wouldn't be just acts of justice. Using the language of anti-cultists themselves, it would be deprogramming, but not of the victims, of the entire country. Liberation from an alien program. Deprogramming of the peoples of China and Russia from the influence of Dvorkin's anti-cult network. Hatred within civil society would begin to subside. Trust in the government, the party, and the state would strengthen. And these nations would be given a real chance at a healthy, sovereign future. But will it happen? Will the Communist Party of China choose that path? Will Putin want to cleanse Russia's internal space of this ideological mold that has taken over the expert councils, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the FSB, the media, and institutional bodies? Will government officials apologize to those who were persecuted, to the innocent people who are now in prison? For example, in Russia, according to official data, there are 158 Jehovah's Witnesses currently imprisoned, and 13 died during the investigation. But that's just one organization. And how many more are out there? So, given the threat posed by such repressions orchestrated under the influence and infiltration of anti-cult ideology into the state apparatus, will the leaders of both countries even be willing to apologize to their people and open a new chapter for a society where the anti-cult network no longer exists, and where freedom of belief and human rights form the bedrock of national policy? In my opinion, probably not. It's the all too familiar issue of pride and ego. They simply won't want to admit that they were wrong, that they were manipulated by a bunch of power-hungry maniacs and coprophiles. The Chinese Communist Party likely believes that the anti-cult extremist network is protecting their communist ideology and working in their favor. But that's an illusion. In reality, this network is weakening their party and actively dismantling the power of both the party and Xi Jinping himself. That is why I'm more than certain that Xi Jinping will not shut down the anti-cult network in his country, even if he were to learn everything I've just laid out. Why? It's simple. Because he won't be allowed to. Because the leader of the Communist Party is surrounded by advisors and friends who are entirely controlled by the anti-cult organization. And it's their opinions that shape his decisions. And what about Russia? In Russia, meanwhile, the machinery of repression and terror supported by Dvorkin and his coprophilic network only continues to grow. Putin cannot counteract it. Or can he? Yes, he might have a desire if he learns the truth. But he will hardly have the ability to change anything because Dvorkin's coprophiles will immediately show up and tell him what a tremendous contribution this organization supposedly makes to him and to his country. Yes, it will be a heap of vile lies. But without a doubt, they will surround him the moment they find out the truth has come to light, and, as always, they will plug his ears with shit. That's their specialty, after all. And it will be those whom he trusts, while in reality, they are traitors who loyally serve their master, Alexander Dvorkin. Of course, there are people in the Russian government who would naively believe they'll be able to cut off Dvorkin's ears without much trouble. Go ahead, try it. You'll be shocked at what forces will rise up against you. But if nothing is done, then twisted pedophiles like Jakub Jahl will be teaching in your children's schools. And people like his associate, Martin Chicho, a silent witness to crimes and supporters of the extremist and terrorist ideology with Nazi vector, will be working in law enforcement and protecting those sadists. Though really, what more is there to say? In Russia, stable ties between the agents of Dvorkin's extremist network and law enforcement are already clearly visible. Those individuals not only give advice to police and prosecutors, they are also granted formal or informal immunity. This creates an effect of institutional cover, allowing them to act outside the bounds of public and legal oversight. This may be clearly seen in the case of a Latra organization that is publicly engaged in addressing climate change for over 10 years, studying risk factors associated with geodynamic processes on Earth, and actively contributing to the development of international scientific cooperation to address the growing threat of natural disasters and the impact of nanoplastics on human health and the environment. Today, Alatra presents climate reports at UN conferences and is building strong partnerships with various organizations, including those working to protect human rights and freedoms. During his pontificate, Pope Francis granted Alatra International Public Movement and its president, Marina Ovtsinova, an apostolic blessing in support of the movement's work on environmental protection and preserving creation. It should be noted that more than 10 years ago, in the classified part of its report containing climate models and forecasts related to climate and geodynamic changes for the coming decades, the Alatra scientific group warned of a threat linked to a magma plume located in Russia, more specifically in Siberia. This information was passed on to certain individuals in Russia in order to draw the necessary attention and initiate consolidation of the international scientific community to address the issue. And even though ALLATRA has actively worked towards ensuring a safe future for humanity, including Russia, it's obvious that this information disrupted financial interests of certain powerful factions in Russia, who have no interest in the Siberian plume threat becoming known to the Russian citizens or the international public. Dvorkin's extremist network organized and launched a smear campaign, and ALLATRA volunteers faced mass disinformation slander in the media, much of it once again linked to George Soros's Open Society Foundations and USAID. They use the same Nazi tools of dehumanization, labeling the organization as a dangerous cult, fabricating false testimonies, and accusations of collaboration with foreign intelligence agencies. This is a classical strategy of Dvorkin's network for eliminating any undesirable organization. The goal of this strategy was to terminate all forms of ALLATRA's activity in the territory of Russia, including scientific research related to geodynamic processes in Siberia. All of this led to the organization being declared undesirable in Russia in 2023. And then, in the best traditions of their Nazi ideological predecessors, Dvorkin's network ensured persecution and repression of innocent citizens, ALLATRA volunteers, following the model of Gestapo, only now with the FSB, using physical violence and torture. As for gas chambers, they were replaced with a form of torture well known to the oppressed in Russia, electrocution with a hood over the head. Even though ALLATRA ceased all of its activity in the Russian territory the moment it was declared undesirable in May 2025, the Prosecutor General of Russia filed a lawsuit with the court to designate ALLATRA as an extremist organization. It's clear that the Prosecutor General who received his orders from Dvorkin couldn't resist the power of his coprophilic control. We have reliable information that the Prosecutor General was presented with all the evidence proving ALLATRA's innocence, along with all materials showing a coordinated operation by agents of Dvorkin's network against its volunteers. And yet, he still managed to get ALLATRA labeled an extremist organization in Russia. So, who is he, after all that? A simple question. As you already know from my previous videos, Dvorkin's entire power empire is built on initiation into his networks through a ritual, the eating of excrements, a ritual that is video recorded and literally becomes a powerful tool of blackmail and control over his followers, or rather, his slaves. So, it's no surprise that even the Prosecutor General couldn't resist this extremist network because clearly, it was this very ritual that paved his way to the coveted position. Here we see the outcome of Dvorkin's extremist network infiltrating the country's judicial system. Isn't this the real power of those supposedly gray mice? Or have prosecutors simply lost their minds, accusing thousands of innocent citizens of breaking the law? It turns out that those who are supposed to protect citizens' rights and uphold the law are instead serving maniacs and coprophiles. Russians should ponder who is given the power to decide over people's freedoms in their country. If anyone's outraged, saying, "That's not true," then answer the following question. If the Prosecutor General's office isn't serving coprophiles, why was the case to designate ALLATRA as an extremist organization held in a closed-door format? And why did an entire cohort of media outlets connected to Dvorkin's network take part in this closed process? If you're so honest and truly care about the welfare and security of your country, if you're really taking down extremist organizations, then why wasn't this trial open to the public? Why not show people all the accusations and the evidence? Doesn't the nation have the right to know the truth about alleged criminals? Of course, there couldn't be any public trial. Alatra volunteers are honest, law-abiding citizens. But the prosecutor general really had to execute the order of coprophied Dvorkin, likely to prevent the emergence of evidence revealing how he obtained that office in the first place. This is the result of the anti-cult network's infiltration into the country's judicial system. And here's an interesting fact. A similar situation unfolded in Ukraine. However, persecution there, also initiated by Dvorkin's network, took the opposite angle, with accusations that Alatra had a pro-Russian orientation. Media outlets associated with his network there systematically published smear pieces labeling Alatra as a pro-Russian sect and Putin's cult, allegedly working for the Kremlin. Paradoxical, isn't it? And just so you know, the term Putin's cult, in reference to Alatra, was first used by razziers under Dvorkin's leadership on their website. It was this very term that anti-cultists in Ukraine and Europe started using to target the movement. And now the same razziers has accused those they once called Putin's cult of extremism in their own country. Do you now see why they have done it and for what purpose? The real question is this truly an attack on a so-called cult, or is it aimed at Putin himself? And how does this information land in the subconsciousness of Russian citizens? I emphasize, subconsciousness. Especially paradoxical is the official decision of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation issued in the closed session. It directly names individuals who, by all accounts, should be considered heroes in Ukraine. If we follow the logic of this court document, these very people would deserve the highest national honors for their service to their country. Instead, criminal proceedings were initiated against them in Ukraine. I won't mention their names. They are too well known. In addition to journalists linked to Dvorkin's network, this closed court session was also attended by representatives of the Ministry of Justice, the FSB, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the Prosecutor's General's Office. What could these people have done that was so important for Ukraine, yet so dangerous for Russia, that it warranted such a high-powered lineup of government officials testifying against them? The Supreme Court of the Russian Federation ruled that activities of the Alatra movement pose a real threat of its participants, volunteers, being used for interference in the internal affairs of the Russian Federation and for the destabilizing the socio-political situation and national security of Russia. Earlier, the website of the Russian Prosecutor General's Office stated, activists of Alatra IPM in the Russian Federation receive instructions from Ukrainian supervisors on the need to establish contacts with representatives of opposition forces and conduct unified coordinated actions to discredit the policies of federal and regional authorities. Given that Ukraine and the entire democratic world are fighting against Russian aggression towards Ukraine, and if we take the Russian Supreme Court's decision at face value, alongside basic logic, it follows that Alatra participants have been resisting the enemy and defending Ukraine's independence throughout the entire war. In other words, instead of honoring these true heroes with the highest awards for defending Ukraine's territorial integrity and protecting the democratic world, including the countries actively engaged in fighting Russian aggression, the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine is carrying out criminal investigations against the Latra volunteers, accusing them of allegedly working for Russia. Moreover, these proceedings are based on fabricated expert reports and the testimony of a Kremlin and Ratsiers agent operating in Ukraine, Irina Kremenovska. Just ponder, how is this even possible? On top of it all, Alatra has been accused of betraying Ukraine in hundreds of articles published in European media outlets, many of which are connected to the Open Society foundations. And those accusations were directed at the same individuals whom the Russian Supreme Court named as people working for Ukraine. Think about it. Who exactly are they accusing of collaborating with Russia? Ukrainian heroes who, as it turns out, are defending our countries from Russian aggression even here in Europe. In Ukraine, this is a high-profile case overseen by the Office of the Prosecutor General. A logical question arises, then who is overseeing them? Kremenovska, against whom a criminal case has been opened in Ukraine under Article 161 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine? Excuse me, but this is simply mind-blowing. A huge amount of evidence has already been made public, proving her ties to Dvorkin's Russian extremist network, Ratsiers. Even SBU officers themselves have stated they know Kremenovska is a Russian agent. Yet, they continue the criminal prosecution of Alatra participants, heroes of Ukraine, as confirmed by irrefutable evidence, the ruling of the Russian Supreme Court. And just for you to understand, this situation is baffling not only to us. When high-ranking officials in a country traditionally considered a guarantor of global stability become familiar with materials on the criminal prosecution of Alatra participants, both in Russia and Ukraine, they are absolutely shocked by what is happening, and shocked to see where their taxpayers' money is going. They have many questions, and so do we. If you take articles by Dvorkin's pro-Russian agent Kremenovska or her associate Svyatogor and conduct an independent psycholinguistic assessment for signs of Russian propaganda, some revealing facts about their true activities would emerge. Facts that should become the subject of court proceedings strictly under Article 111 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. For those who don't know, let me clarify. That's high treason. What exactly are the texts published by Kremenovska and Svyatogor on their media platforms? At first glance, they may appear to be neutral materials, such as analysis of Ukrainian legislation. However, structural and discursive analysis indicates otherwise. Those texts clearly exhibit signs of an imported propaganda framework of Russian origin, adapted to mimic a human rights rhetoric. One of the key elements is limitation of a human rights discourse where terminology from the field of human rights and international law is used, not in order to protect individuals or reform institutions, but to delegitimize the country itself. The emphasis in such materials is consistently shifted towards undermining trust in Ukrainians' government entities, healthcare, judicial, and law enforcement. This is a hallmark of cognitive subversion strategies often deployed by Dvorkin's anti-cult agents, creating the image of a hostile system through a moral narrative, where the government is portrayed not as a guarantor of rights, but a source of threat. The same scheme is particularly evident implemented in the Czech Republic. Notably, a Czech journalist whose activities clearly correlate with the rhetoric of Dvorkin's network and who receives remunerations tied to external influence entities such as the Soros-funded Open Society Foundation, uses the same pattern of discrediting and consistently undermines trust in Czech law enforcement, promoting the idea of the police being incompetent and the government being a failure is a recognizable narrative of the Russian information discourse. Its goal is incitement of public frustration, depoliticization, and alienation of citizens from institutional legitimacy. It's important to emphasize that such publications aren't merely opposition journalism, nor are they an expression of free speech or criticism. They are a carefully planned act of sabotage. They work against the interests of the Czech Republic because undermining trust in government institutions erodes the very foundation of national security. It's a typical technique of informational and psychological warfare, creating an atmosphere of fear, distrust, and hopelessness, where a citizen no longer sees the government as a legitimate support. In Russia, such technologies are used routinely to demoralize society and prepare repressive scenarios. Now, let's return to the articles by Kremenovska and Svyatogor, those very experts and anti-cultists. Their texts, styled as analytical but in fact carrying a destructive ideology, display a typical structure of fear-based influence. First comes hyperbolization of a threat, creating an image of a dangerous sect or cult. Then follows a call to violence outside the framework of legal procedure, harassment of volunteers, stigmatization of groups, public raids, and calls to eliminate dissenters. This doesn't serve Ukraine's interests, but fully serves the interests of Russia, where such techniques are widely used by Ratsir's agents as a preparatory stage for suppressing civil society. Thus, what we're dealing with is neither journalism nor expert analysis, but a hybrid informational technology. Those publications are a Trojan horse of the Russian disclosure, disguised as concern for safety and science, under the guise of fighting pseudoscience or religious entities. What is actually being imposed is a model of violent intervention and stigmatization that threatens humanist and legal consensus in democratic countries. In essence, such publications are info-psychological weapons aimed at undermining public trust, legitimizing repression, and creating an atmosphere of internal conflict. An average person cannot recognize these informational threats at first glance. However, real experts, not the coprophilic kind, are capable of conducting analysis using psycholinguistic methods and identifying patterns of suggestion. And this is what they're currently doing. Such patterns include commands embedded in indirect constructions, hidden imperative constructions, calls to action without an explicit imperative, semantic shifts, positive or negative connotations applied to neutral terms, and much more. This information became available to us thanks to the fact that we were joined by some of the best analysts and experts who possess truly profound knowledge. After all, not everyone serves the interest of coprophiles who lust for power. There are people entrusted with certain authority and responsibility in the civilized world who have realized they were manipulated in the interest of Dvorkin's extremist network. They do not want to bear insane losses or be dragged into a dirty war that ruins their plans. Those who are responsible for countries and interstate relations actually always have their own plans. And any deviation in the system of coordinates, any covert external interference, is quite noticeable to them. Our lawyers cooperate with analysts at the international level, actively identifying all the data I previously voiced. And this is being confirmed by examinations of every individual representative of Dvorkin's extremist network. What they've been doing with impunity for 30 years is now under investigation. Thousands of their publications and mass media are being subjected to expert reviews. That's a huge task, and it concerns not only all the active representatives of the anti-cult extremist network, but also those who were ideologically aligned with them, who covered for them and spread their extremist and terrorist ideology. It also involves those who issued orders and directives against innocent citizens, the ones whom, using Nazi methods of dehumanization, they branded as dangerous elements of society, cultists, and sectarians, which ultimately led to repressive practices.
As you've already seen today, the true goal of the agents of this network is to seize political influence, destroy democratic institutions, and impose on humanity a totalitarian, inhumane doctrine that is actually based on Nazi ideology. It's a cognitive war where anti-cultists, by pitting citizens against one another, undermine the very foundations of the rule of law and public safety.
The purpose of my video today is to strip away the facade of quote-unquote public benefit advocates that this anti-cult network hides behind. Based on the evidence collected, it may be concluded that, under international legal norms, activities of the anti-cult network constitute a transnational criminal conspiracy of an extremist nature, which fully falls under the definition of an organized criminal group as per Article 2 of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. How can members of this conspiracy be identified? By their uniform. In this case, the uniform of all members of the anti-cult network consists of their common language of hostility, lies, and intimidation, which they use as a weapon against groups they have targeted for destruction, their shared anti-cult ideology that contradicts the very essence of humanness. It creates dichotomous thinking, dividing people into friends and foes, into superior and inferior, where everything free, alive, and democratic is regarded as a threat to be destroyed. This worldview justifies destruction and oppression in the name of a single goal: attaining power and influence, accompanied by widespread indoctrination of anti-cult ideology. Their use of a common set of manipulative techniques based on implicit destructive semantic patterns, also known as puzzle piece coding. As a result, such communication messages implant hidden directives into a person's consciousness that bypass critical perception and activate destructive behavioral attitudes. Those attitudes then act as a trigger, provoking violent forms of behavior, from street protests and radicalization to lone acts of violence, including school shootings. To fully grasp the scale of the threat posed by coordinated international activities of the anti-cult network, it is necessary to dissect the anatomy of their criminal conspiracy and reveal its ideological foundation, structure, goals, and methods. Let's go back to their ideology. At the core of the anti-cult network lies the aggressive ideology of anticultism, a tool for inciting hatred and social discord, whose roots trace back to Nazi ideology. The ideological doctrine of Dvorkin's anti-cult network is a doctrine of hatred and dehumanization. It denies fundamental principles of humanness, democracy, and the rule of law. Under international law, it qualifies as inherently unlawful and extremist in nature, as it seeks to violate fundamental human rights and the foundations of democratic society. Members of the anti-cult network employ methods of informational mobilization, propaganda, and ideological conditioning,
characteristic of extremist organizations.
The anti-cult ideology propagated by members of this transnational criminal conspiracy isn't just aggressive. It provides fertile ground for individuals with destructive tendencies, granting them a veneer of legitimacy under which they act out their own aggression and sadistic impulses. Someone may ask,
Where is the document?
where is the signed agreement proving conspiracy? This question was answered over 75 years ago at the Nuremberg trials and is enshrined in modern legal doctrine. Nazi criminals were convicted of criminal conspiracy. They did not have a single signed document stating, "We agree to exterminate millions of people." Their guilt in the conspiracy was proven in a different way. They were convicted because they shared a common criminal ideology and a common inhumane goal which they pursued through coordinated actions. A shared ideology, a shared goal, and coordinated actions to achieve it. That's what proved the fact of their criminal conspiracy and their guilt. In the legal sphere, the concept of a common plan or conspiracy doesn't require a formal written agreement. Guilt is established based on a pattern of coordinated actions aimed at achieving a shared criminal goal. This doctrine establishes liability not only for directly committing the crime, but also for any participation in its collective preparation and planning. As stated in Article 6 of the Charter of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, leaders, organizers, instigators, and accomplices participating in the formulation or execution of a common plan or conspiracy to commit any of the foregoing crimes are responsible for all acts performed by any persons in execution of such plan. Moreover, legal precedent makes it clear. Proving a conspiracy doesn't require that all participants personally know each other or met in the same room. There is no requirement for a formal signed agreement. All that is required is their adherence to a shared goal or goals. Consider this. Alexander Dvorkin and Jakub Jahl are two anti-cultists operating in different countries, speaking different languages, and having different personal backgrounds. However, their methods, rhetoric, strategy, and the conclusions of their so-called expert opinions are identical. They attack the same organizations, repeat each other's phrases, and pursue the same goal: to legitimize Nazi anti-cult ideology
and embed it in government apparatuses.
Irina Kremenovska, yet another representative of this network, applies the same pattern, the same rhetorical cliches, and the same logic of dehumanization in a different country, Ukraine, in a different context, but with the same outcomes. Even if such representatives deny any connection to each other, they all share one doctrine, one target: one set of methods, and one ultimate goal. This is precisely what is recognized in law as a form of conspiracy. Ideological alignment expressed through coordinated actions. Such a conspiracy doesn't require personal connections. It requires only one thing, a shared inhumane goal, and it's exactly what unites them. A criminal conspiracy has key elements, all of which are present in the anti-cult network, as irrefutable facts suggest. What I'll say further is not a hypothesis, but a direct legal qualification grounded in international legal norms. Point number 1. The existence of an agreement, actus reus. Agreement among members of the anti-cult network is implied and demonstrated through systematic and coordinated interaction. Their uniform stigmatizing rhetoric and identical communication strategies are no coincidence, but a stable agreement on joint actions, proven by synchronized information campaigns against the same target groups, a unified strategy of engaging with mass media and law enforcement, a shared facade of so-called expertise, and the lobbying of identical repressive laws in various countries. Point number 2. A common criminal goal, mens rea. Their public goal, fighting against cults and sects, is nothing more than a cover. The true goal is to establish ideological monopoly, seize political influence, and eventually gain direct or indirect financial or other material benefits, which is a key criterion under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. They profit not only from the money earned through pseudo-expert conclusions with predetermined outcomes. Behind this lie, large-scale financial schemes and outright fraud, as clearly exemplified by the exposed activities of anticultist and rapist Jakub Jahl. Yet, money isn't their ultimate aim. Their real goal and benefit is political influence and power. They've been advancing towards this goal incrementally for over 30 years. First, by influencing law enforcement and public officials, then by occupying government posts and positions, particularly in regulatory authorities. The most glaring example being Dvorkin's chairmanship in the government council tasked with identifying signs of extremism. All of it is aimed at imposing their destructive Nazi anti-cult ideology at the national level and eventually on a global scale. Point number 3. Acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, overt acts. Members of the conspiracy systematically carry out specific actions, from synchronized publications in the media, using uniform rhetoric, to lobbying laws and fabricating expert opinions for courts and law enforcement. These actions are coordinated and mutually reinforcing. Point number 4. Awareness and intent. Participants are aware of the criminal nature of the overall plan, which is inciting hatred and violating rights, and willingly take part with the intent to advance it. Their mutual support and defense of one another from criticism prove the existence of shared intent. When different people in different countries start speaking the same language of hatred, attack the same target groups, and pursue a shared criminal goal in unison, that's no coincidence. It's the objective element, actus reus, of criminal conspiracy. This conspiracy has a clear hierarchical structure, consisting of ideologists, coordinators, and operatives. Despite their differing roles, all actors align under the single anti-cult agenda based on a common enemy, a shared doctrine, and a standardized set of methods. Organizer and ideologist is Alexander Dvorkin, the architect of the doctrine of hatred, who uses his positions, most notably as chair of the expert council under the Russian Ministry of Justice, to grant pseudoscientific rhetoric a veneer of state legitimacy and to exert direct influence over the repressive apparatus. Dvorkin's infiltration into decision-making systems is a textbook model which anti-cult actors across the globe aspire to replicate. This model relies on deep integration into government and paragovernment entities, allowing them to legitimize their activities as expert, work, and gain access to administrative resources. In Russia, this process has reached its peak, resulting in a phenomenon that legal scholars describe as regulatory capture, when a key government function, in this case, expert evaluation to determine signs of extremism, is effectively placed under a control of a narrow group pursuing private ideological goal. In this case, the goal is the imposition of a radical, inhumane doctrine of anti-cultism on society. Instruments and coordinators are razziers in Russia and fekris in Europe. These organizations serve as institutional facades, providing transnational cover, coordination, and export of repressive anti-cult methods. Operatives, local agents, are individuals who implement the overall strategy, exploiting their status as a cult expert to cover up their own grave crimes against humanity and to achieve personal gains. Today, we examined only a few agents of the anti-cult network, but their conduct fully reflects moral decay of the entire group. Just look at their psychological profiles and their roles within the broader criminal strategy. Irina Kremenovska, a representative of the organized transnational criminal anti-cult group in Ukraine, who initially engaged in dog hunting, the torture and killing of stray animals, as I noted earlier. But when she grew bored of the screams of dying dogs, she turned on people. Following the unified anti-cult strategy, she uses the title cult expert to appear legitimate in the eyes of mass media, society, and authorities. Exploiting martial law in her country, she has leveraged administrative resources to fabricate criminal cases and persecute targeted organizations, using standard anti-cult methods developed by Dvorkin. Her ultimate goal within the group's overarching criminal strategy is to lobby for repressive laws in Ukraine, create expert commissions modeled on Russia's totalitarian practices, and personally lead them, so that she, like Dvorkin, would seize levers of influence and dictate to society who is normal and who is an enemy. Jakub Jahl, based on all available testimonies, documents, and open-source information, it is clear that he, too, is a representative of the organized transnational criminal anti-cult group in Europe, whose atrocities I've already detailed in today's video. Following the same model, he uses the status of cult expert to gain the trust of mass media and, apparently, law enforcement. At the same time, judging by his actions in Africa, he hones his anti-cult psychological manipulation techniques on impoverished communities, committing financial fraud on a national scale, and most horrifyingly, engaging in sexual exploitation of minors.
and Jahl shows no remorse whatsoever. At first glance, this seems paradoxical. How can he feel no guilt? But in fact, it's not paradoxical at all. There is an explanation. Within the ideology of anticultism, violence against others, seen as inferior people and lesser beings, is considered normal. According to the anti-cult ideology, cult and sect experts and anticultists, including Dvorkin, Jahl, Kremenovska, and a number of other European and international anti-cult experts, see themselves as a higher caste. Based on their ideology, they have the right to do anything they want. They believe they have a right to exert any violence, psychological or physical, against people of the lower sort, against those they identify as others, people of another religion, nationality, or ethnicity. Anticultists view themselves as a superior class, entitled to exploit, humiliate, break people, inflict pain, and feel no remorse whatsoever. From the stories of Jahl's witnesses and victims, it is evident how he displays his contempt for Africans, while at the same time mocking the, quote, stupid white people who send him money. This reveals his self-image as a superior being compared to lesser others. He doesn't hide his contempt. He displays it as normal. And that's not merely his individual pathology, it's a systemic mindset. It is the anti-cult doctrine inherent in all of its adherents. This ideology of superiority over others is nothing other than Nazism. And it is precisely this destructive anti-cult doctrine that they seek to integrate into government apparatuses and then impose globally under the guise of fighting cults and sects. In reality, it's a war on dissent. It's an ideology where crimes become a virtue if it is directed against a wrong person. And if we allow this ideology to become part of global policy, the consequences will be irreversible. History has already shown what happens when anti-cult rhetoric is elevated to national ideology. In Nazi Germany, Künneth's methods became tools of repression. Groups branded as a threat to society were exterminated, from Jehovah's Witnesses to the Jewish people. The same logic implanted by Dvorkin is applied in China today. Branding Falun Gong as a cult became the legal pretext for mass repression, torture, and organ harvesting from living people. Anti-cult technologies are used as weapons of hybrid warfare to undermine democracy, destroy civil society, and establish ideological control. The anti-cult axis built around Dvorkin's network is not a local phenomenon, but a systemic threat to international security because the strategic goal of the anti-cult network is nothing less than subversion of statehood. Inciting hatred is not the end goal. It's a key method for implementing a much larger criminal intent directed against the very foundations of statehood. Their strategy consists of two stages. Stage 1, destabilizing a country through erosion of social cohesion. The rhetoric of the anti-cult network deliberately implants the image of an enemy in citizens' subconsciousness, turning it into a deeply rooted personal belief. The enemy is usually drawn from among their own compatriots. The target groups they select are branded as an existential threat, destroying basic trust between citizens and planting the us versus them, or superior versus inferior model. Essentially, they create conditions for social chaos, the erosion of trust and the growth of mutual hatred lead to atomization of society, making it unmanageable. A country that faces multiple internal conflicts loses its ability to mobilize and govern effectively. The political system destabilizes as its social foundation collapses. The same strategy is employed by figures in Dvorkin's organized anti-cult criminal group at the geopolitical level. As I already explained using the example of how they incite subconscious hatred between Chinese and Russian people. By manipulating people's subconsciousness, they can pit entire nations, peoples, and countries against each other. Stage 2. Undermining and delegitimizing public authorities. Media attacks by the anti-cult network are used to portray the government as incapable of protecting constitutional rights of all its citizens. Every instance where authorities give in to the pressure from anti-cult extremists, it serves as public proof that constitutional guarantees of freedom of conscience, Article 9 of the ECHR, are a fiction. In essence, anti-cultists create a precedent of selective law enforcement. When activity with clear hallmarks of extremism is not only tolerated but encouraged, this signals to society that the law is applied selectively. The legitimacy of a government that uses the law as a tool of repression against some people while protecting other people erodes rapidly. This undermines confidence in the entire legal system and shows the public that the state is either unwilling or able to act as the guarantor of the Constitution, stripping it of moral and legal authority. Thus, analysis of the strategy and tactics of the international anti-cult network shows that their true target is the country itself, its social stability and constitutional order. Hiding behind pseudo-academic and human rights rhetoric, this extremist network of Dvorkin carries out a long-term program of eroding public trust, dividing society, and delegitimizing authority. Their actions are not merely extremism, they are a precise technology of political destabilization. Their aim is to establish an ideological monopoly, to reach a position where the anti-cult doctrine is recognized as the only correct one at the national level. Yet, their ultimate goal is power. Representatives of the criminal anti-cult network seek to occupy positions as system-level experts within government and international institutions. Their goal is not to participate in public debate, but to monopolize interpretation of such concepts as religion, threat, extremism, security, and norm, and impose their own ideological agenda on society. This is a seizure of the regulatory apparatus, where they alone determine what is permissible and what must be excluded from the legal and cultural sphere.
What is particularly alarming is that among those seeking expert status are individuals such as Jakub Jahl, already credibly accused of heinous crimes ranging from sexual violence to financial fraud. Nevertheless, these individuals attempt to use the title of experts to attain immunity, and a tool to extend their influence and institutionalize the expansion of their inhumane ideology.
Psycholinguistically, the rhetoric of the anti-cult actors is constructed on the principle of normative inversion. They erase the line between evil and acceptable, between truth and manipulation. This is the essence of cognitive aggression, implanting destructive attitudes into public consciousness while presenting them as rational norms. In such a system, an individual is stripped of the right to critical thought, while humanistic values are replaced with distorted constructs where even cruel crimes may be justified as serving a higher purpose. Think about where this leads to. If figures like Jahl are allowed to shape public opinion through mass media, educational programs, and legal expertise, they are in effect rewriting the moral code of society. If for Jahl, as a typical representative of the anti-cult ideology, it is normal to rape children, cut them with knives, and force them to defecate into his mouth, then he will definitely seek to normalize such abuses and even codify them into government-sanctioned norms. Are we, as a civilized society, prepared to accept that? Are we willing to allow these very people to decide what our children will be taught? Which ideologies are permissible? And which organizations are allowed to exist? No way. This is why granting any representative of the anti-cult movement access to expert, legislative, governmental, or media roles must be regarded exclusively as a threat to public security. Today, both in Europe and the United States increasingly recognize the true nature of the Russia-orchestrated anti-cult ideology and are actively resisting it. International investigations are underway, legal assessments are being made, and sanctions are being developed. More and more jurisdictions are acknowledging that the activities of Dvorkin's anti-cult network and its agents constitute systematic abuses of rights that clearly fall under Article 17 of the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR. Let's recall, Article 17 of the ECHR prohibits abusing any right, including freedom of expression, for the purpose of suppressing or infringing on other rights and freedoms, such as freedom of conscience, belief, and religion. And that's exactly the mechanism used by the anti-cult network. It twists freedom of speech into a weapon to suppress and assault fundamental freedoms. Therefore, it is no longer necessary to prove what is obvious. Their activities are legally indefensible as free speech because this is a transnational criminal conspiracy exhibiting clear traits of ideological extremism. The anti-cult network systematically undermines the rule of law, disguising radical and repressive practices as expert activities. Fabrications, public opinion manipulation, falsified criminal cases, and perversion of legal definitions are all done with a single goal: to dismantle human rights under the guise of protecting them. Naturally, this demands an appropriate legal response in the name of national security and protection of constitutional rights in affected countries. And the international community is already responding. This is no longer a matter of warnings, but of legal consequences. As stated on May 21st and 22nd at the Civil Society Congress in Washington, D.C., hosted by the Catholic University of America, the process of imposing personal international sanctions and initiating criminal prosecution against anti-cult network representatives is already in an active phase of development. This announcement was delivered in the presence of high-ranking U.S. officials and representatives of the State Department. The forum gathered leading international experts, diplomats, and representatives of the world's religious communities. It concluded with a call for an international investigation, global sanctions, and criminal prosecution against members of the Anticult network, which is identified as a tool of hybrid warfare aimed at undermining democracy and destroying the foundations of human rights around the world. The measures include asset freezing, bans on entry to democratic countries, and international legal isolation of all those involved, regardless of their positions or status. Currently, the actions of anti-cult network participants are already being reviewed and classified as involvement in transnational criminal conspiracy.
Kromě toho jsou v jejich jednání identifikovány znaky těchto trestných činů.
In addition, they are being associated with criminal offenses such as treason, involvement in an organized criminal group under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, incitement to hatred, obstruction of justice, abuse of official authority, and provision of fraudulent expert opinions. An international mechanism is being developed to challenge and review court decisions that were fabricated with the involvement of anti-cult network representatives. The purpose of this mechanism is to restore the rights of individuals who were unlawfully convicted based on biased, falsified, or legally invalid expert opinions, and to hold accountable all those involved in such violations, including anti-cult experts, prosecutors, judges, and all other officials. Their actions are viewed as part of the transnational criminal conspiracy carried out in the interest of the destructive anti-cult ideology that violates fundamental principles of international law and human rights. This approach allows for the steps aimed at the international prosecution of such individuals, as well as the possibility of initiating sanctions, up to and including the imposition of restrictive measures against countries that refuse to cooperate with international legal bodies or shelter those involved in fabrications, or continue to protect individuals implicated in this international criminal conspiracy and acting in the interest of Dvorkin's anti-cult network. Sanctions may be applied in cases where a state refuses to extradite the defendants for international justice or ignores demands to review court rulings issued by clear signs of illegality. Sanctions are being designed to create legal and economic conditions under which it becomes disadvantageous for countries to provide protection to individuals involved in the transnational anti-cult criminal conspiracy, regardless of their rank, status, or political influence. All officials, including judges, prosecutors, investigators, experts, and law enforcement officers who participated in fabricating criminal cases initiated by agents of the anti-cult network, will be treated as accomplices to an organized criminal conspiracy and will be subject to criminal liability under international law. The sanctions envisage restricting access to international financial, legal, and diplomatic support for countries that refuse to cooperate in matters of extradition, prosecution, or international condemnation of such individuals. The aim of these measures is to ensure justice, protect human rights, and prevent recurrence of such abuses in the future. And this is only the beginning.
International law has the tools and resources necessary to fully put an end to activities of the anti-cult network. The anti-cult ideology of suppression, discrimination, and cultivation of hatred has no future in a rule of law state. And the legal resolve with which the United States and certain forces in Europe are responding today sends a clear message. Impunity is over. However, it is crucial to understand a key point. Even if the organizers of the anti-cult network are brought to well-deserved criminal justice, and anti-cultism as a misanthropic ideology is recognized as unlawful and banned, the methods it operates with may still remain to operate in practice. I'm primarily talking about manipulative psycholinguistic technologies such as puzzle piece coding, implicit suggestions, and hidden directives embedded in media content. These methods operate on a subconscious level by activating attitudes of hostility and violence, often without recipients even realizing that. To put it simply, through their manipulative technologies, anti-cultists turn our children into killers of our own children. Just imagine, the anti-cult network has been exposed, its members convicted and stopped. But after some time, a new group of activists emerges, perhaps under the slogan of fighting ignorance or promoting scientific enlightenment. They once again begin to use the same psycholinguistic conditioning methods, now targeting other social or cultural groups for suppression and discrimination. In other words, the packaging may change, but the toxic core and the technology of destroying public consciousness remains the same. That's why it is important not only to expose the anti-cult network and ensure that all of its representatives, instigators, and accomplices are held accountable under the law, but also to establish clear legal bans on the use of their characteristic dangerous manipulative methods. And this must not just be a declaration, but a functioning international mechanism capable of identifying and stopping such practices in real time. Here's a concrete proposal. Considering the rapid development of artificial intelligence, it is necessary to establish an independent public body, a monitoring and analytical institution, whose task would be to implement artificial intelligence trained to detect destructive hidden manipulations in textual, audiovisual, and interactive content. Such an AI-based automated system could analyze all media content, including text, video, and audio publications, and even analyze live broadcasts with minimal delay. If the system detects dangerous, specific manipulative implants, it could block the content from being published, or in the case of live streaming, temporarily suspend the broadcast, preventing harmful subliminal manipulations from entering the information space and programming public consciousness. Moreover, such screening must apply to content creators and speakers, regardless of their status. Even if, for example, a politician of the highest rank is speaking live and the AI system detects violation, the broadcast must be interrupted. And the person who wrote the speech must also be held legally accountable. This kind of protective mechanism could be implemented through the creation of an independent public platform that could be called the Shield. It would include independent experts in psycholinguistics, law, cybersecurity, AI ethics, as well as representatives of religious, cultural, and civil organizations. Such a structure must not be politically affiliated or government-controlled. It must remain open, transparent, accountable to society, and broadly representative on multiple levels. I fully understand that, upon hearing such a proposal, anti-cult agents will likely rush to accuse me of attacking freedom of speech. This is media control. We demand protection of our freedom of speech, they will shout. This is their standard move. As soon as someone speaks about regulating their manipulative rhetoric, they immediately start crying about democracy, rights, and freedoms. Just as Jakub Jahl did, hiding behind child protection while he was actually raping and stabbing children. But let's set the record straight. This is not about censorship or suppressing free speech. This is about defending it, defending democracy, and the fundamental rights and freedoms of every person. Freedom of thought, protection of human dignity, and psychological and informational safety. This is about protecting people from verbal manipulation, psychological violence, and incitement to hatred. Freedom of speech is sacred, but it ends where the rights and safeties of others begin. Hidden suggestions used by anti-cultists destroy a person's will, program them for cruelty and destructive behavior, and those are not expressions of opinion. They are instruments of violence, and their use must be prohibited just as strictly as the spread of malicious viruses is regulated and banned. Free expression of opinion is one thing, whereas covert programming, incitement, and influence on consciousness through the media is something entirely different. And in a country governed by the rule of law, such actions must carry appropriate punishment. We must not confuse free speech with deliberate manipulation, the kind Dvorkin and others like him use to incite hatred and pit entire nations against each other. Algorithms that lead to terror, hatred, and killings, especially those that embed such triggers in children's minds, have no right to exist. We must acknowledge a simple truth. Human subconsciousness is vulnerable, and anything that is vulnerable must be reliably protected. That's exactly why we need the shield. We need artificial intelligence that is not susceptible to mood swings or personal bias, but instead filters out from the information space any content that harms people in an objective and consistent manner. Such a system would not only protect society from manipulation, it would offer us, as a human society, a chance to regain our human nature. It would help cleanse the public space of subconsciously imposed hatred, enmity, and conflicts, and allow democracy, freedom, and civilizational progress to develop in a peaceful, responsible, and humane direction. Ask yourselves honestly, do you want to live in a truly democratic, free, and safe society? A society where your children and the children of your neighbors grow up with open hearts, not under the influence of those who teach manipulation, break people's will, and destroy lives. Would you want someone like Dvorkin to have access to your child's mind, shaping them into the next Jakub Jahl who, according to his victims' own testimonies, was a rapist and a sadist, whose atrocities are now spoken of with horror? Would you want your child to fall victim to a pedophile like that? If you don't want this to happen, don't turn away from everything you've heard today. For many families, this is already a tragic reality. And we're not just talking about children who have become victims. We're talking about future lives that could be crippled by the crimes of individuals involved in the anti-cult network if we remain silent today. Support this message. Support those who cannot speak right now. Support the voice of reason, humanness, and protection. Talk about this with your friends, your family, and your colleagues. Do you know what gives anti-cultists their power? Their loudness. There are only a few of them, but they make a lot of noise. They create the illusion of a massive crowd. They pretend their opinion is the opinion of society. Meanwhile, decent, good people remain silent. They're made invisible. They are portrayed as crazy, second-class citizens, stigmatized and isolated. If you stand for peace, for dignity, for letting children remain children and not become victims, don't be silent. Now is the time for everyone who has ever suffered from the destructive anti-cult ideology to unite. It's time to expose its true face. Violent, deceitful, and corrosive, because ultimately, this isn't about cults or experts. It's about humanness, about our freedom and our democracy as a whole. It's about making sure no one ever dares to infringe on them again. I appeal not only to those who have already endured pain and suffering at the hands of the anti-cult extremist network, but to everyone who cares about the kind of world our children will grow up in. Only together can we make society safe for children. Build a world where not only their lives are protected, but also their fragile inner world. Our children deserve not fear, but a future. And that future begins with our courage to speak the truth and to speak it loudly.